Among the 200 angels who fell, one name was singled out above all others. Not Lucifer, not Samyaza, not any of the leaders. One angel alone was called the source of all sin. He sat with humans and handed them the tools of their own destruction. And when God looked down and saw what had happened to humanity, he buried him alive under the rocks of the desert, bound in darkness, until the final judgment. Today, we are telling the complete, forbidden story of Azazel, the fallen angel who taught humanity the secrets of war and beauty. Long before Azazel's name was written into ancient texts as a symbol of corruption, there was a moment that set everything in motion. In the earliest days of human civilization, when men and women were still learning how to survive on a young and wild earth, God placed a group of divine beings as watchers over humanity. These were the Watchers, an order of angels whose purpose was to observe the world below, to stand guard, and to ensure that humans were protected and guided within the boundaries of what had been permitted. They were not warriors like Michael. They were not messengers like Gabriel. Their role was quieter, more careful. They were witnesses to human life, appointed to watch from a careful distance. But distance became a problem. As the Watchers looked down from their place between the heavens and the earth, they began to notice something. Humans, especially human women, were beautiful. The daughters of men moved through the world with a kind of brightness that stirred something inside these celestial beings. And slowly, the watching became longing. The longing became desire. And desire in beings this powerful would have catastrophic consequences. According to the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that once circulated widely before being excluded from most biblical canons, a group of 200 watchers gathered at the summit of Mount Hermon and made a collective decision. They swore an oath together. They would descend to earth, they would take human wives, and they would live among the people they had been placed to watch. This was not a minor transgression. This was a deliberate, organized rebellion against the divine boundary between the heavenly and the earthly. By crossing that line, the Watchers knew exactly what they were giving up. They knew the consequences. They swore the oath anyway. Among those 200, one name would become the most infamous. One would be called, in the words of the ancient text, the cause of all sin. One would be bound, blindfolded, and thrown into a pit of darkness, there to remain until the day the world itself was judged. That name was Azazel. The Watchers who descended from Mount Hermon each brought something with them. They each possessed a kind of divine knowledge, wisdom that was never meant to enter the human world, and they shared it freely. Some taught the secrets of astrology. Some taught the reading of clouds, the movement of the sun, the cycles of the moon. Others passed on knowledge of roots and plants, of charms and enchantments. These acts alone were considered violations, a breaking of the sacred boundary between divine knowledge and human experience. But Azazel was different. What Azazel brought to humanity was not symbolic or abstract. It was immediate. It was physical. It was dangerous. The Book of Enoch says plainly that Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. Before Azazel's instruction, men fought with stones and wood and their bare hands. The damage they could inflict on each other was limited, but Azazel changed all of that. He showed them how to work with metal, how to heat and shape iron, how to form a blade sharp enough to end a life cleanly and quickly. He taught them the science of armor, how to protect themselves while becoming infinitely more dangerous to others. With this knowledge, war as humanity had never known it became possible. Before long, violence on Earth multiplied. Battles became bloodier. Raids became more lethal. Tribes that once skirmished with crude weapons now clashed with blades and shields. The ground, which had once drunk only modest amounts of blood, was now soaked with it, and this escalation of human violence is traced directly in the ancient text to Azazel's instruction. But weapons were only half of what Azazel gave. The second part of his teaching was aimed at women, and it was just as destructive as the first, only subtler. Azazel taught women the arts of adornment. He showed them how to use colored pigments to enhance the eyes and lips. He revealed the secrets of precious stones and metals, how to wear gold, silver, and gems in ways that heightened beauty. He introduced the use of mirrors so that women could study and perfect their appearance. He taught the techniques of cosmetic decoration, of tinctures and dyes, of arranged hair and elegant clothing. To a modern reader, this might seem harmless, even trivial. But in the ancient world, where beauty was understood as a form of power, Azazel's instruction had a devastating effect. Women who had lived within modest social structures now possessed tools of seduction and attraction that upended the dynamics of entire communities. Men were driven to obsession. Families were torn apart. Social orders built on ancient codes of modesty and restraint collapsed. And as men became more violent through the weapons Azazel gave them, they also became more controlled by desire through the beauty Azazel taught women to weaponize. The combination was precise, almost architectural in its destructiveness. Violence from above, desire from within. Azazel had handed humanity two instruments of self-destruction and stepped back to watch. The Book of Enoch puts it plainly. There arose much godlessness, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. That corruption, the ancient text insists, began with Azazel. When God looked down at what had happened to the earth, the response was not immediate anger. It was grief. The world he had made, the people he had formed with care, were now drowning in blood and desire and godlessness. The noise of it rose to the heavens. According to the Book of Enoch, the cries of the souls of the dead reached the gates of heaven, calling out to the angels and to God himself, asking why the earth had been given over to such destruction. God heard those cries, and then came judgment. God summoned four of the most powerful archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Sarachiel, and Raphael, and gave them specific instructions for what was to be done. Each was assigned a task connected to the damage caused by the Watchers. But the most specific, the most deliberate, the most severe instruction was reserved for Azazel. Raphael was given one command: find Azazel and bind him. The text describes what followed in extraordinary detail. Raphael descended to the desert, to a place in the wilderness, and seized Azazel. He bound him hand and foot. He threw him into the darkness of a jagged pit, into the rough ground of the desert. He covered him with rocks, jagged and heavy, so that Azazel lay in complete darkness, unable to move, buried alive under the weight of the earth. He was not killed. He was not cast into a separate spiritual realm. He was physically imprisoned inside the earth itself, where he remains, according to the text, until the day of the final judgment. On that day, the text says, Azazel will be cast into the fire forever. But the judgment did not stop with Azazel's imprisonment. God also commanded that all the sins of humanity, all the guilt, all the corruption that had spread because of what Azazel taught, be written onto Azazel himself. He was not just punished for his own actions. He was declared the originating source of everything that had gone wrong. Every blade forged in hatred, every act of seduction that destroyed a home, every war that swallowed a generation was attributed to the knowledge he had unlocked. This is a remarkable theological statement. It is not simply that Azazel was evil. It is that he became the designated carrier of human evil. The entire weight of the world's corruption was placed on his back. And why Azazel above all others? Because he had a choice the others did not fully understand. The other watchers were driven by desire, by longing for what they saw from the heavens. Their sin was lust, but Azazel's sin was instruction. He was not simply a being who fell. He was a teacher who deliberately opened a door that should have remained closed. He took sacred knowledge and handed it to creatures who were not ready for it, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That deliberate, calculated act of transmission placed him in a category of evil that stood apart from the rest. Unlike Azrael, whose descriptions focus on cosmic scale and universal reach, what the ancient texts emphasize about Azazel is not his size, it is his knowledge. Azazel is never described as a beautiful, gentle angel of light. Even before his fall, the traditions surrounding him suggest a being of immense practical intelligence, a craftsman of the divine order, someone who understood the deep mechanics of both the material and the spiritual world. In some later traditions and commentaries, Azazel is described as one of the highest-ranking angels before his descent. Certain Jewish mystical texts suggest that Azazel was among the most powerful beings in the divine court, which is precisely what made his fall so devastating. It was not a lesser being who gave humanity the secrets of metallurgy and seduction. It was a senior member of the celestial order. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly in the texts associated with the Qumran community, Azazel is described as the leader of the rebellious spirits. This places him not just as one of the fallen, but as the organizing intelligence behind the corruption of the earth. The Watchers fell because of desire, but Azazel fell because he had a plan. Some later traditions draw a figure with striking similarities to Azazel, though the name and details vary across sources. In these texts, this figure is not simply a rebel, but a being of profound theological sophistication, someone who understood the structure of divine law well enough to find the precise points where it could be broken. What this tells us is important. Azazel's power was not brute force, it was intellect directed toward corruption. He did not need vast wings or a body covered in eyes. He needed only the right knowledge delivered to the wrong hands at the right time. And that is exactly what he did. Of all the ways Azazel left his mark on the ancient world, perhaps none is more striking than the ritual described in the Book of Leviticus, deep in the laws of the Hebrew Bible. On the Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar known as Yom Kippur, the high priest of Israel was commanded to bring 2 goats before the congregation. Over 1 goat, prayers and sacrifices were offered to God in the traditional way. But the second goat was handled differently. The high priest would place both of his hands on the head of the second goat and confess over it all the sins of the people of Israel. Every transgression, every wrong, every failure of the entire nation for the past year was symbolically transferred onto the animal. Then, the goat was led out into the wilderness and released at a place connected, by name, to Azazel. This animal became known as the scapegoat. It carried the sins of the people away from the community and into the wilderness where Azazel was imprisoned. The theological connection is unmistakable. Just as God had commanded that all the sins of humanity be written onto Azazel in the Book of Enoch, the ritual in Leviticus enacted that same principle every single year. The sins were returned to their source. The corruption that Azazel had unleashed on the world was sent back to him symbolically in the form of an animal burdened with communal guilt. Some scholars interpret this ritual as a form of ancient cosmic accounting. Azazel had introduced sin into human civilization. Every year through this ritual, the people were reminding themselves and reminding the spiritual realm of where that sin had come from. They were acknowledging the origin of evil and symbolically placing it back at the feet of the one responsible. Others interpret the ritual as a form of appeasement, a remnant of an older tradition in which Azazel was understood as a desert demon or spirit who needed to be placated so that he would not disturb the living. In this reading, the goat was not a statement of judgment but an offering. Either way, the ritual placed Azazel at the center of the holiest moment in the Jewish religious calendar. He was not forgotten. He was not simply buried and ignored. He was acknowledged, named, and given his due, even in the most sacred ceremonies of the people who feared him most. This is what separates Azazel from other fallen angels. He did not fade into mythology. He was written into the law. The Book of Enoch is the oldest and most detailed source for Azazel's story, but it is far from the only one. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran in the mid-20th century, Azazel appears in apocalyptic texts that describe the final battle between light and darkness. In these documents, Azazel is not just a fallen angel. He is a leader of the forces of darkness, a figure whose imprisonment is temporary, whose release at the end of days is part of the final confrontation between good and evil. The Damascus document, one of the key Qumran texts, refers to the Watchers and their corruption of the earth in language that closely echoes the Book of Enoch. Azazel's role as the one who first opened the door to divine knowledge being misused is consistent across these texts. In rabbinic literature, which developed over centuries following the Hebrew Bible, Azazel takes on additional dimensions. Some rabbis debated whether the scapegoat ritual was truly sending the goat to Azazel as a spiritual entity, or whether Azazel simply referred to a geographic location in the wilderness. But many agreed that the name carried weight beyond geography, that it pointed to a real spiritual force. The Targum, ancient Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, often interpreted Azazel as a fallen angel or demonic entity, preserving the older understanding from the Book of Enoch. In Christian traditions, Azazel appears less prominently in official texts, but resonates in the wider discussion of the origin of evil. Early church fathers who wrote about the Watchers and the corruption described in Genesis 6, where divine beings took human women, sometimes connected this directly to the traditions found in the Book of Enoch. Azazel's role as the teacher of violence and seduction aligned well with early Christian concerns about the corrupting influence of demonic knowledge on humanity. In Islamic tradition, the figure most closely associated with the Azazel tradition is Harut and Marut, two angels described in the Quran who descended to earth and taught humans knowledge that could be used for good or ill. This connection is not direct, but the structural parallels are striking. Divine beings who cross the boundary between heaven and earth, who bring knowledge to humans, and whose actions lead to widespread corruption and suffering. What connects all of these traditions is the same core idea, that there was a moment at the very beginning of human civilization when a door was opened that should have stayed closed, and the being who opened that door, deliberately, willfully, with full knowledge of what would follow, was Azazel. Now, the question that comes up often is, are Azazel and the devil the same? In popular understanding, Azazel and the devil have become blurred. Modern films, books, and series frequently cast Azazel as a demon, a devil, or a stand-in for Satan. In the television series Supernatural, Azazel is portrayed as a powerful demon with yellow eyes, one of the most dangerous forces in the entire narrative. This representation draws from the deep fear his name has carried across centuries, even if the specific mythology has been reimagined. But in the original texts, Azazel and Lucifer are distinct. They are separate figures with separate stories, separate crimes, and separate punishments. Lucifer's rebellion, as described in Christian theology, was a war in heaven. It was cosmic, spiritual, a rejection of God's authority from within the divine order. Lucifer fell upward, in a sense, in that his ambition was to transcend God, to place himself above the throne. Azazel's crime was the opposite. He descended. He came down into the physical world and made it worse. He did not want to rule over God. He wanted to reshape humanity. His sin was not pride directed upward toward the heavens. It was interference directed downward toward the earth. This distinction matters. If Lucifer is the symbol of rebellion within the divine court, Azazel is the symbol of divine knowledge turned against the creatures it was meant to protect. Lucifer's fall was a theological tragedy. Azazel's fall was a practical catastrophe. Some scholars of comparative religion suggest that the two figures represent two different ancient answers to the same question. Where did evil come from? The Lucifer answer is internal. Evil began when the most beautiful of God's angels turned against him out of pride. The origin of evil is therefore a spiritual, almost philosophical event. The Azazel answer is external. Evil entered the human world through instruction, through the deliberate transfer of forbidden knowledge from divine beings to human ones. The origin of evil is therefore a social, almost technological event. It happened when someone taught us something we should never have known. Both answers survive because both feel true. We recognize the evil that comes from within, from pride and ambition, and the desire to be more than we are. And we also recognize the evil that comes from knowledge used without wisdom, from tools that outpace the moral development of those who wield them. Azazel represents that second kind of evil. He is not a tempter of the soul. He is a teacher of destruction. And in a world still grappling with the consequences of weapons and vanity, his story has never felt more relevant. Because Azazel's name appears in the Bible itself, unlike many figures from the Book of Enoch, his presence in culture has been persistent and wide. Writers across centuries have returned to him again and again, drawn by the combination of his specific crimes, weapons and beauty, and the severity of his punishment. In the 19th century, when writers and theologians were beginning to re-examine the Book of Enoch after its rediscovery in Ethiopic manuscripts, Azazel was often discussed in connection with the Romantic-era fascination with fallen beings. The Romantics, who had made a kind of hero of Lucifer in the spirit of Milton's Paradise Lost, found in Azazel something more troubling. Not the noble rebel, but the dangerous teacher. In the 20th century, Azazel entered wider popular consciousness through the expansion of supernatural and occult literature. Occultists who worked within the traditions of ceremonial magic, including those who built on the earlier work of grimoires and mystical texts, placed Azazel in the hierarchy of demonic beings. Some identified him with the wilderness and the desert, fitting for a figure buried in the barren ground. In contemporary fiction and television, Azazel has become one of the most recognizable demonic names in popular culture. In the comic and graphic novel world, Azazel has appeared as a villain with connections to both demonic power and forbidden knowledge, often cast as a being of manipulation rather than brute strength, which is entirely consistent with his original mythological profile. The name itself carries a distinct sound, ancient and threatening, that writers and filmmakers have found irresistible. It suggests something that was known before recorded history began, something buried and waiting. In Jewish traditions, the Day of Atonement continues to preserve the memory of Azazel in liturgical practice. The word appears in the Torah, in Leviticus 16, and has been discussed, debated, and interpreted by rabbis for over 2,000 years. The scapegoat tradition, even in its modern symbolic form, keeps Azazel's name alive in the most sacred contexts. And perhaps that is the most powerful thing about Azazel's legacy. He is not just a monster from an old book. He is woven into the fabric of how human beings have tried year after year to account for the evil in themselves and in their world. Every time a community has asked the question, where did our worst impulses come from and how do we send them back? They have been in some ancient and indirect way answering to Azazel. Now that you know the full story, how do you understand him? A destroyer who corrupted the world, or a figure onto whom humanity placed the sins it could not accept as its own? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Next, watch our video on Azazel, the scariest angel that ever lived. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.